Welcome back to the Exposing Grief YouTube channel. All here we are removing that stigma of grief and exposing it for what it truly is, which is a natural and healthy way of living and loving. For the month of August, I want to talk to you about this idea of mourning. Do you know the difference between mourning and grieving? If not, stay tuned. We'll talk about the difference as well as some ways to tap into the mourning part of the grieving process. So let's jump in. When we think of a loss, what do we think in terms of the process of handling that loss? Grief, right? Grief is attached to loss. Grief and loss. Sorry for your loss, therefore you must be grieving. So yes, while grief and grieving are a very important part of the process that comes after a loss, mourning is also part of that. So what's the difference? Grief or grieving is the internal experience that comes from the loss. So this is our narrative, right? Our self-talk, our thoughts. This is the physical symptoms that we can experience. And this is how the emotions and how they show up internally, how we feel those. Mourning is the outward expression. So this is the outward expression of our grieving experience. Talking about it, crying, whatever it might be. And that's kind of what I want to focus on today, is give you some tools and tips on how to tap into the mourning side and the mourning process of our grief journey, because it's a very important part and it's something that's not talked about very often. So let's dive into some creative expressions that will help us and encourage us to tap into that mourning side. The first form of creative expression I want to talk about is what I call written word. And this is what I use a lot with my clients. A lot of my clients use the written word form. And so this could be a plethora of things. It could be letter writing. This is kind of the most common one that I have guided clients through. And that could be a letter to yourself, whether current, past, future, whatever it might be. The most common is a letter to their loved one, whether it's what they want them to still know, what they wish they could have said. If they have questions for them, we can tap into that through letter writing. Written word creative expression might also be writing poems, if that's your background. It could also be a book, right? There are a lot of individuals who, after their loss and having gone through their grief journey, they write a book, whether that's a memoir or an educational thing or a self-help book. Written word could also just be journaling. That's a very common therapeutic exercise. So the journaling could just be stream of conscious, which is you set a timer and you just write. You don't pause, nothing, no corrections. You just write whatever's in your head. And then there's some exercises you can do in going back to it. People also might journal just about stories and memories. So if written word is more up your avenue and something that you connect with, I would encourage you to try the written word expression for mourning, to use that as part of your grief journey. Another great form of creative expression is through arts and crafts. So some of the arts might be painting, drawing, ceramics, sculpture, or something a little bit more abstract. Art therapy is a real thing. There are clinicians who are there, specialized to guide individuals through an art therapy process, which puts a little bit more of a therapeutic spin on what they're creating artistically. Some of the craft side of things could be scrapbooking, so just putting pictures of your loved one and your relationship into a scrapbook, or maybe collecting some of their favorite belongings and finding a way to put that together. I've also seen quilting, so taking shirts usually are the most common, but some other favorite clothing items or whatever it might be, and creating a quilt out of those. My childhood dog passed back in 2012, so what I did is I took a compilation of a bunch of our favorite pictures and put them in a blanket that we created, and then my mom has that hanging on her wall, so she sees our little Bujo every time she walks into her home office. So that's another way to kind of tap into that creative side if written word or verbal communication isn't the best way for you to tap into that mourning piece, that outward expression. So if you're more creative, artistic, try some of these arts and crafts ideas to tap into that mourning process. Music and movement is also another great way to tap into that creative expression to begin encouraging that mourning part of your grief journey. So of course, music, some of the most common is songwriting. So if you're writing poems, maybe you want to put that into a song, or you want to play around with lyrics and writing a song that either reminds you of your loved one or is based off of your journey, whatever it might be. Songwriting can be a very popular thing. Also, I came across someone had mentioned putting a soundtrack together, which I thought was really cool. So a soundtrack that either mirrors or represents your relationship with that person, or it could be a soundtrack of songs that remind you of your person and your relationship, or it could be a combination of both. So songwriting, turning poems into music, putting a soundtrack together that either represents your person or your relationship. Also, if you want to play an instrument, if you don't want to put words to it, a lot of beautiful things can come out of just making music. And then, of course, dance is going to be the most common movement. There's some beautiful pieces that represent their loss, grief journey, whatever it might be. So again, if you are more of a dancer, music inclined individual, and this resonates more with you, I would encourage you to explore what pieces of that will help you tap into and encourage that mourning process as part of your grief journey. So the last form of creative expression I want to talk to you about is this externalization, which if you're not fully familiar with what that is, I'll cover it briefly. But if you want more information on it, go check out my last video from July about reclaiming your independence from grief. And it dives a little bit deeper into what externalization is and how you can get that and start playing around with that for your journey. Essentially, externalization is this idea of making something its own entity, so it's separate from who you are. So it would be making grief or the mourning process separate from who you are as a person. So it's really defining, how does grief show up? So that can be another great way to creatively express how grief is showing up internally, which then allows you to outwardly express it because you're referring to this own entity and not so much you yourself, because that can be very vulnerable when we're talking about ourselves. So now if we can talk about this entity, this own thing that we label as grief or whatever, it can be a little bit easier for us to talk about it. Sometimes we can combine these creative expressions, right? So externalization could maybe be combined with writing a story, right? And we write a story about this entity that we created through externalization, or we write a song or create a dance number about this entity that we call grief, or however you want to label it. So externalization is another great way to creatively express our grief, allowing us to tap into that mourning process. Again, if you want more information on externalization, be sure to check out my most recent video about reclaiming your independence. And I realize there's probably a bunch of other different creative ways to express and tap into the mourning, but these are just some of the few that I wanted to highlight. If there are any that you have come across or that you want to share, please comment below. Reach out to me on Instagram at exposing_grief. I'd love to hear what you're using as creative expression for not only your grief, but also to tap in and encourage that mourning process as part of your grief journey. So now that we have some forms of creative expression, let's talk about why we do it, other than that it taps into that mourning process. So some of the benefits of doing this, again, encouraging that mourning process, which is important, one, because it's part of a healthy grieving process, but also it helps us as an individual put words, meaning, understanding to experiences that we maybe wouldn't be able to put words to ourselves. So this creative expression allows us to tap into that a little bit differently. And then in the same vein of things, it allows our support system to better understand and hear what we're experiencing, which then allows them to support us a little bit more efficiently or differently if that's something that's needed. Some of the risks to keep in mind when engaging in creative expression: if there is unprocessed trauma attached to your grief journey, that's something to be mindful of. Research shows typically we'll want to address the trauma first before doing the grief work, because if we do the grief work, that triggers the trauma and it could potentially cause more harm. So something to be mindful of. Also, if we don't have a good basis or coping skill or toolbox for regulating emotions, that's also something to be mindful of. These creative expressions, any sort of processing through our grief, can trigger a lot of emotion. And if we don't have the skills to properly regulate, bring ourselves down, reground, balance those emotions out, it can be really tricky, because now those emotions are triggered and we're sitting with them in full force and don't really know what to do with them. So being mindful of if there's any trauma attached, or if we have a lower ability to regulate emotion, that's something to be mindful of, as we don't want these healthy exercises to cause more harm. So just something to take in consideration as you explore the mourning process of your grief journey. What do we think? We've got some creative forms of expression to start encouraging that mourning process of our grief journey. We know the benefits, we know the risks to be aware of and stay mindful of so we don't cause more harm than good. I am excited for you guys to go out and try this on your own. I encourage you to explore whatever feels right for you. And if you try something and you go, no, that didn't really click with me. Okay, now you know, try something different. If none of these resonate with you, explore something of your own. Is there something that gets you really excited and that allows you to tap into that? I'd love to hear what you're doing. So comment below, follow me on Instagram at exposing_grief. You can email me, which is below in the chat as well. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any other content coming your way, and happy creative expressing that mourning part of your grief journey. We'll see you soon.